From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. We have a real special program here tonight. We are not discussing this with a practitioner from the time, but an observer of the times. Our special guest is Chuck Johnson. Chuck, we like to call him, is the Dean of Capitol Reporters. Since he first was sitting in the Capitol taking a look at things happening in the 1971 session, Chuck has been involved as a reporter, one of the best in Montana, all the time until today, 42 years. So he's been through it all, he's seen it all, and his observations are very, very important to getting a sense of the period. So Chuck, welcome to In the Crucible of Change.
Thanks for having me, Evan.
Yeah. When you first went to work in this period, remembering we're talking about that magnificent change that took place between 1965 and 1980, progressive change that really reshaped the state of Montana, you went to the legislature in '71. And you were an intern at the time, but you were specifically covering a couple major issues on behalf of your mentor at the University of Montana. Can you tell us a little bit about what your mission was and how it all got started?
Yes, my mentor was Ellis Waldron, a longtime political science professor at the university, and there were 4 of us interns, and he assigned us each a topic to follow during the session and even before the session, and then write a paper on it afterwards. And I originally was going to do redistricting, which I thought would be very interesting given the history of it. But then he said, no, I think you ought to look at executive reorganization. And to be honest, I was a little disappointed, and I still kind of peeked around at the redistricting just because it was interesting. But I'm glad I covered what I did. And I went to all the hearings, I listened to all the debates, I took notes, I gathered materials, and then went back and wrote a pretty lengthy paper on it all afterwards.
What I want to know about that paper is this. Did you get an A?
I did. For length, maybe, more than anything.
Well, actually, though, that is one of the most thorough and accurate contemporaneous report on that major activity that was done. You know, when newspapers, it's always got to be abbreviated and shortened up. There were no formal reports by the government that followed other than the implementation. So your report stands out as something very, very important, and it kind of resurfaced a couple years ago when you reminded me of it in the governor's office, and so I got it and copied a few extra copies, and we've circulated it around because it really tells the story from a very objective way and very thoroughly. I compliment you on the effort, but it's a very important document.
Well, thanks, Evan. It was fascinating to cover because the whole of state government got changed by this effort to reorganize, and it was highly controversial. And there was some doubt whether it would even pass because all the affected agencies generally were against it, and all the interest groups that were served by these various boards and bureaus stood against it as well. So it was a real challenge to get it through, but in the end it passed in a bipartisan fashion through the House and Senate, and Governor Anderson signed it into law, and it was his baby. There was there was, it was his singular achievement, I think, the passage of executive reorganization.
You know, he always thought that that was the biggest thing that he did, and if he did nothing else, even if it didn't help him, I think Alec Hansen reported that on one of our previous programs, was that even if it didn't help him immediately, it would help all future governors in terms of having those lines of authority and responsibility. How did you see portrayed the condition of state government before that happened? What was the challenge there?
It was the way I think a lot of state governments were originally set up, and they didn't trust authority or want direct responsibility, so they had all these boards and commissions and bureaus, and the way it worked for most state agencies, I think at the time, was the governor would appoint a board, and the governor didn't get control of that board. They were usually 7-person boards, and the governor put a person on every year. So a governor didn't get control of the board until his 4th year in office. And I believe it was these boards in general that picked the director. Mm-hmm. So if there were trouble in one of the agencies, those directors reported to the board, not the governor. So it was an easy way for governors to duck responsibility, as they say, well, it's the Board of Livestock or the Board of Institutions or the Board of this or Board of that. The Revenue Department had a 3-person, it was a 3-headed agency, the Board of Equalization. And it just wasn't efficient, and very hard for governors to come in with an agenda and want to get it passed.
It's kind of revolutionary to have a governor say, I not only want to enjoy the perks of being governor, but I actually want to govern.
Yeah.
Which is basically what Forrest Anderson was saying.
It's like the federal government. You have an executive, the president or the governor, a straight line down to the department, whether it's state or commerce or agriculture.
One of the things that I guess I would submit, and we've discussed it in other programs, is that in addition to the people who were in the departments or were on the boards, who certainly didn't want their life upset by doing anything differently, which is kind of a natural thing, but they were always standing in opposition to the change. And some of the interests that were served were looking the same way. But the case has been made that, in fact, a government executive branch that was not managed well for purposes by elected officials meant the state was more easily dominated by the special interests of the state. That they, in fact, could prevail, their will could be carried out a lot better when you had a weak executive branch, and what was at that time, even prior to that, a weak legislative branch. Without modernization, that those two things made it easy for people like the Anaconda Company and the other, whatever you might call the special interests of the state, to actually, get their way.
I would agree. You had a weak legislature, which was one that was pretty easily lobbied. Mm-hmm. You had a weak executive, and
so who's in charge?
Yeah, who's in charge? And it was a governor that maybe functioned well in times when there wasn't much going on, but as we entered the 1970s, I mean, Montana's population was growing. We had a lot of change. We had the environmental movement, the women's movement. We had coal being mined out in eastern Montana. I mean, it just wasn't efficient to run this creaky old system like we'd had in the 20s.
Yeah. So looking at that, they had 6 hearings at night. Everyone lined up to say what a wonderful idea this was, I presume.
Oh no, it was widely condemned by the boards and bureaus, and widely condemned by the industries that were regulated by these boards and bureaus. There was little support except from groups like maybe the League of Women Voters. Yeah. It was, nobody liked change.
Well, I guess that's a human condition. However, again, in one of our programs that focused on executive reorganization, I know Representative Tom Harrison, who was on the commission and then later carried one of the bills to get it implemented, made the point that the legislators looked up and saw this opposition and thought to themselves, well, what do we expect?
Yeah.
you know, and they eventually kind of dismissed all that negativity and said, obviously this is going to get done. But one of the reasons that happened was that constitutional amendment in 1970, and you reflected on that in your paper, the impact of the 2020 amendment on the reorg process.
Yeah, it was a constitutional amendment that was passed pretty wide margin,
Yeah.
and they came up with this 20's plenty, which was a nifty slogan that said, hey, that's all we need, and you can throw all these squares and rectangles and circles within the confines of the 20 departments. What happened at the hearings was interesting. Probably the most strenuous opposition that carried the most sway came from the cattle industry, the Montana stock growers. And they were able to keep the livestock department the same way it was probably run since the beginning of the state. The board runs the department, the board picks the director, they call it the executive officer. I think fair to say it maybe hasn't been one of the best run departments in state government over time, with some exceptions. They've had some good directors. There was an effort by environmental groups to do the same with the Department of Fish and Game. And there was an ongoing political feud between the director, Frank Dunkel, who was kind of a hero to environmentalists at that time, and the Anderson administration. And in that case, they turned down that.
It kind of looked as if Forrest said, I'm going to give you one to the stock growers in hopes that it'd get the bill through.
He didn't.
But I'm not giving in on this fish and game thing.
He didn't yield on the fish and game thing. And the interesting thing is, a few years later, maybe 8 years later, I guess, Dunkel was the regional EPA director down in Denver in the Reagan administration. And I think fair to say the environmentalists thought him as not such a friend then. He was working for Jim Watt and the Reagan folks.
Yeah. Now, also in the and again, I think that we have digitized your report, and it's going to be available online through all the libraries in Montana. So your report's going to get much wider recognition now. But in addition to this reorganization, the other big ticket item in the '71 legislature was the sales tax, which, as I recall, caused them to go through the regular session, the 60 days, and 2 additional special sessions, and summit committees and foothills committees and God knows what, until they finally resolved in terms of putting it on the ballot. What were your reflections on what happened in the legislature on the sales tax, and then we'll talk a little bit about what happened afterwards.
Yeah, Montana had a revenue crisis at the time, and there was already a 40% surtax on income taxes. And the Republicans wanted to get rid of the surtax and add a sales tax, 2% sales tax. And there was a strong battle between 2 extremely strong leaders, Governor Anderson and the Speaker of the House, Jim Lucas, a powerful Republican representative from Miles City, and often thought to be, a potential governor candidate. And they had a number of battles, and they finally decided, let's give the voters a choice. There was going to be this special election in November anyway for Constitutional Convention delegates, so they put it on as a referendum. And
again, my recollection was that there was a 40% income tax surcharge, or the alternative was a 2% sales tax and a 10% surcharge.
Lowering the surtax to 10.
And that's what unlike today, you could have an either-or choice in those days on the ballot.
That's right. Yeah. And so you have this election in November anyway, so let's settle it there.
Piggyback them. Yeah.
And
then we got into the politics of selling the sales tax politics, which we've discussed in some other programs. But it was obviously a tough sale for Montana. It was obviously a corporate-backed effort that, one of your compatriots, Dan Foley, had a lot to do with exposing who was putting the money behind the sales tax, as I recall.
There were two groups. Cost was the against sales tax group. And
Citizens opposed to sales tax.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then there was the SOS, Save Our State.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting story in that I believe the Harry Billings, and
Right.
as part of cost, went to court to say, let's see their records. We didn't have the same laws making those records available now. And the guy who was the treasurer for
Ken Nybo.
Ken Nybo, I was wondering.
Ken Nybo, yeah.
He said he was hunting, and he was out hunting, and nobody could reach him. Well, Judge Victor Fall, I believe it was the day before the election, ordered a
Show
hearing.
cause hearing, yeah.
And the records became public, and it showed what everyone suspected, that the largest corporations in the state were bankrolling the pro-sales tax campaign.
And pretty amazing to see on election day as people got up to vote. Here on the front page of all the papers was a story about the corporations pushing the sales tax. You couldn't buy advertising like that if you're on the other side of the issue.
Yeah, and they would have been much smarter to put it out earlier. But
Yeah.
so the voters go to the polls and they reject the sales tax 70 to 30. They go for keeping a 40% surcharge on income taxes and no on the sales tax. And at the same election, they're electing con delegates. Now, as I recall, there were 58 Democrats elected, 36 Republicans, and 6 independents. If you go back and look at the makeup of the legislature in the 1970 election, the Republicans had about a 6 or 7 vote lead in the House, Democrats about the same in the Senate. So the con election, I think, definitely was influenced by the sales tax vote, and I think it gave Democrats a big boost.
Well, I think it was the tilt that the Republicans were obviously identified with the sales tax. The Democrats were big opponents to it, and as a result of that, you know, they picked up significant strength in comparison to before.
No question about it.
Yeah.
No question.
Now, that sales tax election having impacted, and again, I look at it as kind of the serendipitous thing that happened. If you're a progressive, that all of a sudden you had that tilt to the Democrats. But the reality was that in those times, there were a lot of progressive Republicans, and especially in those that ran, and independents, and especially those that ran for the con. And there was a reason for that in terms of who could run for the con.
Yeah, there was a debate in the legislature about whether legislators and other current elected officials could run for the con posts. And so they filed a kind of a friendly lawsuit with the Montana Supreme Court to get an answer. And in the legislature of 71, the court said, no, you can't run if you're already holding another job. You'd be holding 2 offices at once. And I think the legislature was very disappointed. Legislators wanted to run for con, the off year. And so they were not happy with that decision. But that was another key to me why the con did so well.
Because of that, it wasn't round up the usual suspects. Now, there were about a third of them were former legislators, or maybe a quarter of them were former legislators, but couldn't be any sitting legislators. So it took it kind of out of the realm of everyday politics into maybe where it should have been, which is thinking about the long-term structure of Montana and how it should work.
That's right, Evan. I mean, you got people like one guy was a beekeeper. You got a Catholic priest, a Methodist minister, a congregational minister. You got...
So we had God on our side when we wrote our Constitution. Yeah.
Well, George Harper was the Methodist priest, and he came up with the slogan. He said what became the slogan on the bumper stickers, praise the Lord and pass the Constitution.
Yeah.
But you had a really interesting mix of people from all over the state. Some were legislators, some were former legislators, some had been county commissioners or mayors. You also had, I think, 19 women.
Yeah.
And in the in the 1971 legislature, there were 2 women out of the whole legislature. Dorothy Bradley was a freshman in the House, and Toni Roselle was a longtime senator in the Senate. 1
Democrat, 1 Republican woman. And if you go back in through the early part of the 60s, into the 60s, and I've looked at that, there was another Republican woman somewhere in there, but it was pretty lean pickings when it came to women. And a case can be made that the doors were blasted open for women's participation at the electoral level by the con.
I don't think there's any question about that. And it might be worth now talking about the role of the League of Women Voters. Mm-hmm. It was a very significant group then, probably more than now, and they were among the leading advocates for a new constitution, and I think for executive reorganization. And they were really played a key role, and a couple of the key people that lobbied at the legislature became delegates. Dorothy Eck of Bozeman and Daphne Bugbee of Missoula both became delegates, and they'd play a very key role as lobbyists.
Well, you know, we're lucky enough to still have Dorothy Eck, who will appear on one or two of our programs in this series. We don't have Daphne around anymore, like so many of the Constitutional Convention delegates. Every year we have a reunion, and then the rooms get smaller.
Dorothy was one of the officers. I think she was the Western District Vice President.
She was the third vice. Yeah, she was the third vice chair. They balanced it out rather interestingly, because they had essentially what was almost a partisan vote for the chairman, and Leo Grable was elected, and people wondered, but he turned out to be one heck of a chairman of that convention. But then I think they picked Bruce Brown out of Miles City as a Republican first vice chair, and then they had Dorothy, and then they had Gene Bowman was the secretary out of Billings.
John Toole, too.
And John Toole. Yeah, well, he was the first, yeah. So, you know, they did a good job of balancing it out, but Dorothy and Gene Bowman were officers of the convention. So again, I think it did blast the doors open.
No question about it. The other thing that they did at the convention that I think the legislature ought to look at doing too is they didn't seat people the normal way where the Democrats were on one side and the Republicans were on the other. They sat alphabetically. And it was a definite effort to say, we're not going to be partisan. And I remember the newspaper folks met with, the editors met with the CON leaders before the convention. And they were telling us we should not put, you know, Delegate Daphne Bugbee, D. Missoula. We should just say of Missoula, because that would introduce partisanship. We argued that by putting that would show, if there wasn't partisanship, it would demonstrate it. And so we continued doing that. That's how we always do it with the legislature. We put the party abbreviation and then the town they're from.
Well, they spent their first few weeks in committees, and then they started doing a lot of floor activity. But it was, again, Leo Grable seemed to have run a pretty tight ship as far as the management of it. Was there skepticism abounding about their ability to even put something like that together, a constitution? Or
I think the Helena lobbying crew, the trade association folks, were sort of poo-pooing it, saying this will be a big bust, and they have all these inexperienced people, it'll never work. And frankly, there was some doubt about Leo. Leo was I think fair to say, a fairly abrasive guy. He'd run for Congress twice and lost, and you know, there were no people either liked Leo Grable or didn't, and I'd have to say he turned out to be an excellent president of the convention. He kept it moving. I believe it finished on time, or even maybe a couple of days early, and under budget. So I think he was a strong leader, and that's just what the convention needed.
Yeah, and I don't know who came up with the alphabetical seating, but I think it may have extreme relevance today as we get divided. Government is so divided that maybe some kind of a solution like that might be helpful, because it's like nothing else seems to be helping. In the period we're in now, the divisiveness is so much. And it certainly was a divided political arena back then. I mean, the Democrats and Republicans were like cats and dogs, but nonetheless, when they sat together like that, whether it was the mission itself or whether it was the seating was a big part of it, they were forced to work together. And sometimes you say there's a solution looking for a problem, but maybe we have the problem now, and maybe we ought to be looking at that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think it'd be great if the legislature did that. I don't see what the disadvantage would be. Sitting next to someone of the opposite party would be like, why not talk to that person? You might agree on something.
It's interesting to reflect from the current time or in between, back to that time, but wasn't there some kind of a thing that happened at the CON related to the audacity of the Constitutional Convention delegates to require the lobbyists to disclose their spending or something?
Yeah, I think the way it had been prior to that with the legislature, lobbyists had to register with the Secretary of State's office then that they were going to lobby for these groups. But at the Con, they followed what a number of states had done and said, okay, you not only register, but you file a monthly report and say how much you spent lobbying. And there was great criticism of that by the lobbying groups, but they did it, you know.
Well, they had to.
And it took another 8 years to get the legislature to pass that, and it only passed because of an initiative led by people like Paul Richards that passed in 1980.
You know, it is the pervasive influence of the lobbying crew, whether it's on K Street in D.C. or sitting between the two chambers on soft benches in Helena. There's no way you can underestimate the impact of those folks who are sitting there day in and day out during the session. And it was interesting to have them take that role. I think the Con showed a forward-looking approach on many things like that. You know, now the Constitutional Convention wrapped up. I want to talk about a couple of provisions that relate to the press, and then we'll go into the election. But one of the things which, since you're a member of the press, that may be of some great import in that Constitution is the openness, the transparency, the open meetings, open records type of provisions that are in the Constitution. Can you reflect on that a bit?
They added a provision that says something to the effect that all meetings shall be open and all documents are open unless the right to individual privacy clearly exceeds the merits of public disclosure. That was added late in the convention, and the news media lobbyists strongly opposed it. They felt it would lead to chaos, that it would lead to many lawsuits. And I remember the Billings Gazette ran a front page editorial saying, if they kept this in the convention, we're not going to support the document.
They weren't opposing the openness, they were opposing the balancing act.
Yeah.
You got to see if it offsets the privacy right. And because we had such a very strong privacy right in the Montana new Constitution too.
I think we were the first state constitution to have an explicit right of privacy, and I still think some have an implied one, but ours is explicit.
Yeah. So it ended up in there, however, but as a result of that, would you say that the new Constitution, as it's played out and as the implementing legislation took place, has really helped with the public being involved and more knowledgeable about what's going on?
I think so. I think it has led to many lawsuits, and I think media groups have won the majority of them. But I think some groups get tired of having to sue all the time.
Yeah. And
we've seen some kind of shenanigans where the Montana School Boards Association, there's another law in place that if a group or a citizen goes to court over a right to know provision and prevails against a government agency, the person can ask the court to have his or her legal fees paid.
Mm-hmm.
And school boards were prime offenders. And, where a school board would meet at somebody's house before the meeting and figure it all out and go through the motions at the meeting. In the last 5 or 10 years, maybe 5 years, school boards will turn around before that lawsuit is filed and file one against the media group that's planning to sue to prevent that fee getting paid.
So just a technical way to avoid the fee.
Yeah.
Well, you never know about that.
But there've been a number of documents that have come out over the years that I think we would not have got otherwise.
Well, there's an innate desire for secrecy among, people who are making decisions and have to worry about justifying them. And there's always a flow of paperwork underneath every kind of decision in the government, where there's a lot of thinking out loud that is often the kind of stuff you don't like to read in the paper. But the fact is, we do now seem like we have a lot of transparency. And
I would agree. Not as much as we'd like, but just an example, our papers, as well as some other media groups, made a request to the Bullock administration to get all the emails and other documents earlier this year when Governor Bullock was trying to consider who to appoint to the U.S. Senate seat that he later appointed John Walsh to. And that was interesting. We found some interesting documents. So I think on the whole it's better. I think there's still a tendency to be secret. We also filed a lawsuit some years ago, a number of media groups, to open legislative caucuses, which had always been closed.
Yeah.
And that's been kind of a Pyrrhic victory. We won the victory, but I think it's driven, we won the case, but I think it's driven...
underground, huh?
They meet at other places, but there have been a couple key times when we've been in there and gotten some really significant things, like
the time that, what's his name from Billings flamed out?
that was the one I was thinking about. His name was Mike Lang, and he was the majority leader of the House.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think the openness is a big part of the Constitution, and I think they set the tone at the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah. Now, some other things in the Constitution, in terms of women, had this great representation of women who played big roles in it, in the Constitution itself and its promotion. And then there were good provisions in the Constitution about equality that are very important. So can you reflect on that in relationship to what was the rather rapid evolution of the women's movement politically in Montana at that time?
I think the women's movement was occurring at the same time, and we have a strong human rights provision. You know, some people at the time said we had a stronger one than was proposed in the federal ERA, which Montana ratified, but it's never taken effect. And important to remember, too, one of the speakers at the convention was Jeanette Rankin, the first woman elected to Congress and twice elected to Congress from Montana. The delegates tried to bring in prominent people to offer their thoughts, and Charles Lindbergh came to speak. Jeanette Rankin.
Two people who opposed World War II, interestingly.
That's right.
You know,
And there were some others, I think, that came, and it just had a feeling different than the legislature. It was like, we're here for serious business, and we want to hear from the people. And they put all their bills out, their proposals out, and they also invited the public to offer their ideas. And so each committee then took up the public ideas, and I think incorporated some of them in what they ultimately adopted.
Well, I suppose that's basically what it should have been about, which is they were and the fact that they weren't there representing their parties or anything like that, or their special interest group for that matter. The breakout was kind of interesting. Now it passed. I mean, it was written up, and it was signed by all the delegates. Although a number of them said, "I'm going to sign it."
Yeah.
But I may not support it.
I think about 10 or 15 ultimately campaigned against it.
Uh-huh.
And it passed by the skin of its teeth. Very, very small majority, slight majority. It passed by.
You know, my recollection was that 10 counties voted in favor of it and 46 counties voted against it, but there was enough of a majority in the 10 counties to carry the day.
And these were, I believe, most of the urban counties.
Urban counties. There was a significant urban-rural split on that vote. Now, the Constitutional Convention allocated, I think they had some money, and they allocated $45,000 to promote the Constitution. And but they wanted to do it. Somebody filed a lawsuit to stop them from doing that?
Yeah, I think it was the Montana Taxpayers Association and some other business groups went directly to the Supreme Court and said they can't spend public money on an educational campaign. And the Supreme Court agreed.
Which is really, by the way, kind of interesting, since just only 2 years before, in the 1970 ballot, there was money spent to put out the 20s plenty message.
Yeah.
So
and I think it was a split decision by the court. And Leo Graybill was speaking somewhere a day or so after that decision and criticized the decision. And they hauled him before the court with a threat of contempt.
Yeah.
So he had to kind of make up to the court, but it was seen as a pretty outrageous move.
My recollection was reading the was at the time it became a real almost cause. Well, what's the Supreme Court doing? They're saying you can't spend money, and if someone says something, they're dragging them in front of the court like it's the Middle Ages or something.
Yeah.
And I think it started to hit on the court, and they kind of backed away, it seemed like, after they did a little thing like this to Leo. Okay, because I think they were afraid to go too hard on him.
As I recall, Evan, they got blasted by the newspaper editorials and widely condemned around the state for basically interfering with his free speech rights.
Yeah. So meanwhile, of course, I think a private group was formed and ginned up about $10,000 to spend on that campaign. And I think, did they operate out of the Colonial Inn or something?
It's interesting. Betty Babcock, the former First Lady, and her husband Tim Babcock, the former governor, owned the Colonial Inn at the time. And Betty said, well, we'll just open an office here. I don't know if Tim necessarily agreed, but the joke was always that maybe their votes split on the con-con. But Betty donated office space, a copier machine, and all that. And they had a big number of volunteers that were sending out mailers, sending out things, and they all worked out of the Colonial. They didn't have an advertising campaign per se. They just sent out mailers and things.
And praise the Lord and passed the
They had
Constitution.
to praise the Lord, pass the Constitution.
Yeah.
And on the other side were the groups you'd expect, the utilities, the railroads, the taxpayers, the Farm Bureau, kind of the conservative interests of Montana. And they were, the ag groups particularly were concerned about the water rights that might come out of this document. And I think that's one reason it failed so badly in rural Montana.
Now, you know, I guess you could make an evaluation about things generally, in a sense, that those who are comfortable with the way things are will always fight for the status quo. And that is what was happening here. It was those who were comfortable.
I think that's a fair assessment. Yeah.
Those who were not comfortable or were looking for change. There's an interesting dynamic that goes on all the time in that. Now the Constitutional Convention had three side issues because they, I think, very wisely said if we put gambling, unicameral legislature, or the death penalty in it, maybe make the choices for people. We put them in the main body. It'll sink the thing. There'll be so much divisiveness about what to do or not to do. So they put them on the side issues, didn't they?
They did, and I think a majority of the delegates might have voted to put one House legislature, the unicameral legislature, in. But I think wiser heads said, let's leave it up to the voters.
Yeah.
Death penalty, same thing, and that's always controversial whether we should have the death penalty or repeal it. The gambling under the 1889 Constitution, it prohibited the legislature from even legalizing any gambling. So what the net effect was, we had this statewide ban, but gambling was sort of a local issue, and in some parts of the state, it was fairly wide open, others it wasn't. And from that provision that passed, the next legislature came in and legalized bingo and keno, and through some attorney general opinions and court decisions, keno became poker, and anyway, a long list of changes got made. But it was a smart decision. The problem it created was more people actually voted on the side issues on the ballot in June of '72 than the Constitution itself.
Mm-hmm.
So the Montana Farm Bureau and others went to court and said, if you look at the number of people that picked up a ballot, a minority actually voted for the Constitution and a majority voted against it.
And since the Constitution said a majority of those voting,
Yep.
they alleged that it didn't pass, and that did go before the Supreme Court.
It went to the Montana Supreme Court, and the election survived on a 3-2 decision. And then it went, the Farm Bureau and others went to the U.S. District Court to challenge that, to appeal that, and it failed. But you know, it was a legitimate point they were making. Although, and you know, some places like Silver Bow County, they voted against the Constitutional Convention, against the new Constitution, but for the gambling provision. although gambling wouldn't take place unless the Constitution passed.
That's right. You had to have the Constitution passed to have the side issues work. It was kind of interesting. The net effect of that, of course, was that a narrow decision, 5-4 or 3-2, reminds me of what's going on in the U.S. Supreme Court today. Almost every significant decision that's divisive at all is 5-4. And so you don't feel too comfortable about it. But that being the case, once it became the Constitution, it was the Constitution. And it is looked upon as perhaps the best state constitution in the nation. Maybe it's just a product of its time, but...
Well, I think it was a product of its time. I think if we'd had the Constitutional Convention 15 years later or 15 years earlier, we would have gotten a completely different product.
Or if we hadn't had the sales tax vote on the ballot at the same time. There's, as I say, a lot of accidents happen in politics, but that may be one of them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the credit goes to the delegates that they got a lot of flack from the powers that be, the current legislators at the time, people saying you couldn't get it done, and they got it done, and they did it in time and under budget.
Well, remember that the theme of this series in the Crucible of Change is, in fact, that of the people wresting power away from the powerful and empowering themselves somewhat. And the Constitution was clearly the fulcrum upon which a lot of that stuff was balanced and tilted.
I would agree, Evan, and they made wholesale changes in state government. The Bill of Rights was expanded. There's a provision that didn't get actually implemented till 6-7 years ago, but it was the right of that everyone in Montana schools should learn about our Indian heritage. It wasn't funded until like 6 or 8 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that was, I think, the last provision to be funded, and it was like, yeah, we'll have Indian education, we just won't fund it. Yeah. And now every student in Montana schools, from start to finish, learns about our ancestors.
I worked with Governor Schweitzer at the time when he proposed that we really actually do what we said we were going to do, and that was I think a very proud moment that we were, in terms of who we were doing it with and for, but also that to actually ignore a provision of a Constitution seems to be for political convenience or whatever, or maybe philosophical convenience, who knows. It's nice to have something like that come to fruition finally.
I would agree. The other thing it did, it actually puts a measure on the ballot every 20 years on whether Montanans want to call another constitutional convention to go through the process again.
We just had that.
We just had it. It's been on there.
Twice. That would be
twice,
the second
I think.
time.
Yeah.
And I don't remember what the vote, but I suspect it was fairly overwhelmingly against it. In fact, I may have voted against it. In fact, I think I did vote against it. Now,
the other thing
the local government review is a 10-year thing, and one of the things that was interesting was the opportunities that were presented in empowerment of local government, which was is a creature of state government.
Yeah, and through that, I think Butte and Silver Bow County became a consolidated government, as well as Deer Lodge County and Anaconda, the only two in the state. Mm-hmm. And I think it's proven pretty successful in both of those areas. The Constitution also gave, for the first time, the right of citizens to do initiatives to amend the Constitution. They could do initiatives to change law, but this gave them the right to do initiatives to amend our Constitution. Mm-hmm. So it was a people-oriented process that really restored a lot of power to the people, or gave it to them for the first time.
So suddenly we have the executive branch reorganized. We have settled the sales tax issue for a significant number of years. We have a new Constitution. We're faced, while the Constitution was being drafted, we were choosing a new governor. It kind of just happened. It was very important to all those playing, but while it was going on, we ended up in the fall of 1972 with Tom Judge, former lieutenant governor, running against State Senator Ed Smith, and Tom Judge won a fairly comfortable victory and became the new governor. And it was remembering that Forrest was the first Democratic governor, one term only, selected after 16 years of Republican governors. Then you had a new Democratic governor. There's a transition, which aren't automatic, but there was an amazing amount of continuity between those two administrations, which maybe helped carry forward these reforms that Forrest was seeking. Have you thought about that at all?
I think Tom Judge kept a lot of the key people that Forrest Anderson had appointed. And one of the top priorities that Tom Judge had was he now had to implement the new Constitution, and the legislature that session had to do it. And we were faced in '73 with the first annual legislative session in state history. That was a key reform of the Constitutional Convention. And there were annual sessions in '73 and '74. And unfortunately, the legislature didn't get to meet before all that happened to put out new rules. So what happened so often in '73 was if your bill looked like it was going down, you'd say, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to postpone consideration of my bill until 1974. So a lot of the work got delayed till '74, which provoked a lot of criticism. And then some of the business groups, the Farm Bureau, the Chamber of Commerce, put an initiative using, I think it was the first initiative to amend the Constitution that was used to go back to annual legislative sessions, although longer than before. So we only got to try annual sessions those 2 years, and they really didn't get a chance to work. My take is with biennial sessions and now with term limits, we have a legislature that's considerably weaker than it was in those days, and they really
it was weak, and it's weak in a different way,
yeah.
then, because it does have staff and it does have structures like the Legislative Council and Legislative Auditor, and they have a fiscal division. They have a lot of that stuff
no
going
question
for
about
them.
that.
But they're meeting every 2 years in a modern day.
Yeah, they do have a great legislative staff with top-level researchers and attorneys, auditors. Mm-hmm. But they meet for 90 days every 2 years. I mean, can you imagine a corporation meeting like that? Or they're not there to address breaking problems, and governors really don't like having them around much. They run things when the legislature's not around, and the legislature sits home and says, "I wish we were there."
Well, I was there when we had the back-to-back legislators, and it was a difficult thing to adjust to. Remembering we went from 60 calendar days to 90 legislative days twice.
Yeah.
And it was difficult to get, and I remember in the Judge administration, which I'd gone back to, saying, well, gee, are we ever going to get a chance to govern, because we're either preparing for, in the middle of, or we're recovering from a legislative session. That being said, I mean, the vote was fairly overwhelmingly to go back to biennial sessions, and there's 2 times since then it's been tried to change it back. It hasn't succeeded.
Yeah, the standard joke you hear from people is the legislature meets for 90 days every 2 years, and the people of Montana wish it met for 2 days every 90 years. But I think the legislature in the current position is a weakened branch with that, and also term limits, despite having an excellent staff. And I wish that's one we could revisit sometime.
Yeah. So we have we now have a new governor, and they're starting to implement this stuff. And so things like open meetings, for example, I mean, the general language in the Constitution doesn't take you anywhere. You got to have specifics to guide you. In addition, the same thing with executive reorganization. Even when the department structure was put in place in '71, there was a lot of things that underneath that had to keep being implemented, you know, rules and regulations and processes and everything else. What was your reflections looking back on it as a young reporter about that time? What reflections do you have in terms of its impact, how difficult or easy it was?
Well, there was an enormous amount of work to do. I mean, just things like changing the name from the Board of Equalization to the Revenue Department. You know, hundreds of changes of names in state law, and so lots of sort of procedural changes, but also some significant ones to implement the provisions. It created one of the things it did is directed the creation of a consumer counsel office. That had to be implemented in law. It created it gave constitutional autonomy to the university system through the Board of Regents. All that had to be implemented in law. And so this is in addition to all the normal things that come before the legislature. So there was a lot of legislation to be written and implemented. And I think, fair to say, the legislature and the judge administration were drinking water through a fire hose. I mean, it was just hundreds of bills that had to be put into place, and you're probably good there were the 2 years to do it. And you know, but eventually it got done. Some of it faster than others, and then we had this new government in place, and people were getting used to it, and used to open meetings, used to the university system having a constitutional autonomy. I remember when they asked the legislature for a lump sum budget. Just give us the money, we'll divvy it up as we see it should be done, the regents said. And why, Francis Bardno and the top legislators were appalled. How could that not be a legislative function? There were a lot of tensions between the legislature and some of these the new agencies created, the new powers, but eventually they got straightened out. It just took a while.
Now, your reflections on Forrest Anderson are predominantly driven by your singular experience in '71, and you were not really heavily involved beyond that before he suddenly wasn't there. I'm one that goes to the belief that the governor is the single most important election in a state because it impacts the direction of state. He or she impacts the direction of state government more than anybody else.
I would agree.
And it's not far away, Washington, D.C., so and there's only 50 of these folks, and so who the governor is makes the biggest difference in my estimation. And so we had Forrest, and then we had, in this period of change, we had 2 terms with Tom Judge. Can you give whatever reflections you might have on Forrest as you knew him or had it reported to you, and then your reflections on Tom Judge's, particularly in the implementation of all this stuff? You know,
Well, Forrest Anderson, and I interviewed him a few times after he was governor and watched him in action as a legislative intern. He was a tough customer. I mean, he was probably the most qualified governor in state history.
Amazing resume, yeah.
Yeah, he'd been a legislator, a county attorney, a Supreme Court justice, and attorney general before he was governor. He was a hands-on operator, not much into the PR. He just did what he thought was needed. Tom Judge, on the other hand,
you could tell that when he went to Miles City and said farmers and ranchers don't pay their taxes. You remember that?
he was, I think, without question, the best qualified governor we had ever had in terms of his background. Tom Judge came up from the legislature. Tom Judge was also a public relations man, had an agency, and was much better at the public relations. Tom was also the youngest governor in state history. Tom was probably the governor who, I think, sort of brought government to the people. He'd have meetings out in the state with people in Billings and Havre and Bozeman. Tom was kind of a young Kennedy-esque governor in his own way. I don't know that Tom was interested in all the details as much as someone like Forrest Anderson was. I think he was more interested than the big picture, than kind of what made it all work. But he had pretty capable people around him, top to bottom.
I would have to say that 80%, I'm pulling that number out of the air, but I feel comfortable with it. Probably 80% of the leadership of the Anderson administration in terms of department heads and other key administrators were retained by Governor Judge, so he certainly wasn't trying to start from ground zero.
No, and that was a smart move, and they had to implement, they had to put in place all these new departments, and provisions of the Constitution. So he did have an enormous number of people that had served under Governor Anderson.
Mm-hmm. Now, again, looking at this thematically, Chuck, that the period of change that took place here was progressive change, and it was predominantly an empowerment of people in one way or another, as compared to the previous power structure of Montana, which was clearly, we were almost a colony of the Anaconda Company. Unlike any other state in the nation, they were so dominant compared for 75 years. One, could you just quickly reflect, and then we'll be wrapping, just quickly reflect on the empowerment of people, and whether you thought that really occurred?
Oh, no question about it. And he was responsive to the environmental movement that wanted to regulate the strip mining of coal, to put in the coal severance tax, so that some of the proceeds remained in Montana. It didn't just get sent out of state as it did with the copper mine. We had the Human Rights Commission was created under Tom Judge, again implementing the Constitution. Workers gained the right, state employees gained the right to collectively bargain for the first time. That was implemented under Tom Judge. Over and over again, you saw that kind of thing happening. And it didn't happen all at once, but enormous things on the environmental. I think there were a commission to deal with women, issues related to women. There were health issues that came up, but over and over again, the attitude was more, let's bring in the public and hear their opinion, not just top down, but bottom up.
Mm-hmm. Well, the empowerment of people is, and at least in our system of government, is an objective we all should try to seek out. And well, we're about to run out of time here. It's amazing how time flies. I only have about 10 more things to ask you about. But if you'll hang around for a few more years, we might do another program.
Okay.
Anyway, it's been a pleasure to have you here, Chuck. You've added a dimension of thought here that comes not from as a participant, but as a objective, one of the best objective observers of what went on in the Crucible of Change during all that period of time. So thank you so much for your participation.
It's been my pleasure, Evan. Thank you.
Yeah.